Herding cats. All right, I'm David Gordon. I'm a member of the Thoreau Society Board. I teach philosophy at Loyola University in Baltimore. It is my pleasure to introduce our next panel, Inspiring Revolution. Our first speaker is Frank Cronin. Frank Cronin retired 2 years ago after teaching 35 years at Austin Community College. In retirement, he is tutoring part-time at Austin Community College and serves on the board of Dark Sky Texas, the state chapter of Dark Sky International. His talk will be on Franklin and slavery, a man of his time, a man ahead of his time. Geoff Wisner is the author, editor, and book reviewer based in New York City, also a board member of the Thoreau Society, and the editor of Thoreau's Wildflowers, Thoreau's Animals, and A Year of Birds. He's also coming out with another book this fall, George Templeton Strong, Civil War Diaries. It'll be published in November by the Library of America. China Mullinax, our next speaker, is a part-time editor for pre-medical school students and a homeschool teacher to a 7th grader. Her talk will be More Than a Shared Love of Nature, Thoreau's Countercultural Influence on Gary Snyder. And then our last speaker today is Gregor MacGregor, a teaching professor at the University of Colorado's Environmental Studies Professional Master's Program, where he leads the Environmental and Natural Resources Policy Specialization. He has also held a faculty fellowship at the university's law school to direct the school's pro bono water and agricultural law project representing minority farmers. His talk will be Thoreau's Revolutionary Praxis.
Good morning. Space, time, and ideals connect the American Revolution with the Transcendental Movement. Geographically, Concord and Boston were the centers of the Revolution and Transcendentalism, scenes of very different kinds of battles. Chronologically, only a few decades separated the Revolution and the Transcendental Movement. In the early 1820s, 14 combatants of the battles of Lexington and Concord were still alive, as well as many of the country's founders, Madison and Monroe, John Jay, Jefferson and Adams. More importantly, ideals connected the two movements. Theodore Parker and others saw Transcendentalism as the second American Revolution, an attempt to refine and improve upon it by advocating for a more just economic system, advancing the rights of women, and of course, fighting for the abolition of slavery. Though the founders kept slavery as a part of the political and economic landscape of this American Revolution, early America had an abolitionist movement which came to prominence in the late 1780s and early 1790s through the efforts of Benjamin Franklin and others. In his time, he was the best known of all the founders, having an international reputation for his studies in the science of electricity. And to this day, he remains the best known. Despite his towering presence in our history, Thoreauvian scholarship has rarely referred to Franklin. This is puzzling, as he and Henry David Thoreau have much in common. They were active in the civic life of their communities. Franklin formed the Junto, an organization of Philadelphia merchants who gathered regularly for self-improvement and set a model for useful societies that spread throughout the colonies. Likewise, Thoreau was very much a part of the Lyceum movement as organizer and speaker. Both men had deep spiritual lives. Franklin's was rooted in the belief that doing good for society was a religious virtue, a spiritual pragmatism. Though Thoreau's spirituality was quite different, a mystical bond with nature and a strong ethical framework, it was just as deep. They were both successful in business. Franklin's success allowed him to retire before he was 40. Thoreau's work with the family pencil business and experiments leading his experiments leading to the right combination of graphite for the new electrotype technology put the Thoreaus into the middle class as represented by the family home on Main Street. Both were talented. They were masters of the aphorism. Franklin's pithy almanac dictums, also a focus of Thoreau's early journals and a mainstay of his later writings. Finally, another similarity was their support of the abolition of slavery. We Thoreauvians know Henry's involvement, what we know less of Franklin's decades-long journey as a slave owner and committed opponent of slavery. At the time of Franklin's birth, 1706, slavery is well established. Already the young economy of the economies was dependent on the source of this diligent and cheap labor. Though most of the slaves were south of what was later called the Mason-Dixon line, slaves lived in the northern colonies. Numbers of the slaves increased rapidly in the opening 2 decades of the 1700s, so that by 1730, at least 10 to 20% of the populations of Philadelphia and New York City were slaves. Slave trade existed not just as an integral part of the colonial economy, but also as an integral part of the religious worldview of the colonies. Despite the just social gospel of Jesus Christ, who exhorted believers to care for the least of these, the Christians of the colonies bent their beliefs in such a contorted pretzel theology that they could easily approve of and participate in the slavery of a whole group of people. Franklin grew up in such a religious city and region and household, Boston, Massachusetts, the center of Puritan life. 2 of colonial America's most influential clergymen, Increase Mather and his son Cotton, shaped the spiritual thought and the politics of the region. On slavery, Cotton Mather wrote that it was a spectacle that shocks humanity. In his view, the slave was like a child to be tended to and directed by the master in a fatherly way. Of course, the slave was to be converted and saved for Jesus, as he explained in a pamphlet, The Negro Christianized. It's interesting, too, that his congregation bought him a slave named Onesimus, who, as it turned out, was not always so grateful for Mather's attempt to act as a Christian father. From early on, Ben understood the conundrum of slavery. It was both condemned and condoned. Franklin's older brother James was a printer and publisher of one of the country's first newspapers, the New England Courant. The teenage Franklin worked as an apprentice in a legal contract that bound him for many years. James was the first publisher in the colonies to feel confident enough to use his paper to speak out against the powers, the most religious ones, in Boston. And then he stood firm for the freedom of the press rather than give in to those powers who wanted to censor his newspaper. Franklin admired his brother for his principles, but because of the tensions between the two, Franklin broke his contract in 1723, ran away to Philadelphia. In the 1720s, Franklin spent some time in England working in the printer's trade. Upon his return to Philadelphia, he focused on establishing himself as printer and publisher, and in 1728, he had his own printing business. In the following year, he bought the Pennsylvania Gazette from a former employer, Samuel Keimer, and like his brother's groundbreaking paper, sought to entertain and inform the reader by providing a forum for ideas. In that same year, Franklin printed his first anti-slavery tract, A Brief Examination of the Practice of the Times. And then the next year, an expanded version, The Mystery of Iniquity. Its author, Ralph Sandiford, a Quaker merchant, had witnessed slavery in the Caribbean and South Carolina. He branded the slave trade immoral, held the churches and their ministers as being in a large part by their approval of or silence about slavery to blame. Sandiford argued against biblical justifications for slavery and even pointed out that in the Bible, slaves at some times were to be freed, and that certainly wasn't happening in the colonies. Though Franklin printed this tract, his name was nowhere on it, though printers usually put their names on what they printed. This is an example of the pragmatic Franklin, balancing his interest in new and unpopular ideas while at the same time protecting his reputation in business. Sandiford passed on copies of this to another Quaker, Benjamin Lay, an odd man whose life reads like a back-to-nature hippie of the 60s. Lay farmed, tended bees, made his own flax, and took to living in a cave to be closer to nature. Decades before Thoreau, he was an early opponent of the increasing materialism in the colonies. He bought expensive china just to smash it in the public market, as he considered ownership of it a sign of vanity. His principles also centered against the slave trade, and Lay carried on the moral arguments of Sandiford. He referred to slavery as the mother of all sins. He argued that slavery hurt not only the slaves, but the whole of the slave-owning community. In 1737, again without listing his name as printer, Franklin put out Lay's "All Slave Keepers That Keep the Innocent in Bondage." Franklin's pragmatism extended beyond his anonymously printing these tracts. He also printed notices for runaway slaves. Obviously, he didn't view their Declaration of Independence as he viewed his own. His was a model Declaration of Independence. While runaway slaves were hunted until caught, then not only returned to servitude, but severely punished for their declarations of independence. Franklin also printed advertisements for the sale of slaves, which usually took place within a short distance from his shop. Certainly, Franklin witnessed the brutal, degrading treatment of fellow human beings, inspected as one would inspect cattle, and the heart-rending cries of children and parents as buyers and sellers tore families apart. But colonial America was a complex system of degrees of workers, from the lesser apprenticeship he experienced to indentured servants, bound servants, the convicts of the Georgia colony, and the slaves. In a land with a shortage of labor, all kinds of work arrangements were welcome, and as many of the time argued, Franklin among them, totally necessary. His increasing public profile as a doer of civic good put him in touch with other shapers of early Philadelphia. In 1739, he befriended George Whitefield, a very popular Methodist preacher from England. Certainly, Franklin was drawn to him in part because Whitefield was his own man, an outspoken critic of the Anglican Church and most clergy. In a pamphlet Franklin published in 1740, Whitefield spoke out against the treatment of slaves. He wrote, "Your dogs are caressed and fondled at your tables, but your slaves, who are frequently styled dogs or beasts, have not an equal privilege. Nay, some have been upon the most trifling provocation cut with knives and have had forks thrown into their flesh." Whitefield called the doer of these deeds monsters of barbarity, and wrote that if the slaves were to exact any sort of retribution, it could only be looked upon as just. Yet Whitefield too owned slaves. Again, slavery condemned and condoned. Being the scrupulous printer, Franklin no doubt read all that he had printed. Being a deep thinker, he no doubt thought about the arguments against slavery. Yet in 1748, he purchased the first of his many slaves to work in the printing shop and stationery store which his wife Deborah managed. In 1751, Franklin wrote an essay, Observations Concerning the Increase of Mankind, Peopling of Countries, etc., that Africans should be kept out of America. One reason was the detrimental effects that slavery has on whites. Franklin wrote, slaves also pejorate the families that use them. The white children become proud, disgusted with labor, and being educated in idleness are rendered unfit to get a living by industry. Franklin remarked that almost every slave by nature was a thief. He went on, but perhaps I am partial to the complexion of my country, for such kind of partiality is natural to mankind. He complained regularly about his slaves in very racist terms by describing them as sullen, malicious, revengeful. And notice that Franklin isn't arguing against slavery for the terrible effect on slaves. A deeper influence on Franklin was the work of Dr. Thomas Bray, who in 1723 started the Associates for Founding Clerical Libraries and Supporting Negro Schools. Though Franklin never met Dr. Bray, he later joined the association and met one of his associates, Anthony Benezet, who started a school for African American students in Philadelphia. Benezet strongly impressed all those who met him. Dr. Benjamin Rush wrote that he is not only a good man in the full import of those words, he appears in everything to be free from prejudices of all kinds. Rush thought him to be an almost isolated example of a person being about the Father's business. Franklin became involved in this school in the late 1750s by contributing money and by making regular visits. Being a scientist, Franklin observed and formed conclusions, letting facts lead him to a different point of view. After a visit to the school, he wrote of the African American children as having made considerable progress in reading for the time that they have had, respectively, been in school. He also remarked that they learned as quickly as white children and that he didn't see any difference intellectually between the two groups. This was a radical idea even among some opponents of slavery. The overwhelming accepted opinion of the time was that all Africans and African Americans were without a doubt possessing fewer qualities of character and intellect than whites. By 1769, Franklin viewed the more negative characteristics of slaves as being a product of the negative environments and experiences of slavery rather than of the slaves' natural traits. In retirement, Franklin became more involved in the politics of Philadelphia and Pennsylvania, and on separate occasions he represented Philadelphia and later the colonies in London, with stays of many years in the 1750s, 60s, and 70s. Of course, during his long stays in London, Franklin sought out those of like mind, people who thought daring thoughts, ideas that were ahead of their time, men who did daring things like experiment with electricity. He enjoyed the stimulating conversation and rich meals with good wine that aided the digestion of food and ideas. He considered London to be the intellectual hub of the world, and though he loved his wife, town, and colony, it would have been fine with him to have settled there permanently at this time. He had much admiration for England and considered himself a loyal subject of the king. In England, he met men who were dedicating their lives to the end of slavery, and those friendships influenced him mightily. Richard Price was a member of the Club of Honest Whigs that met regularly for food, drink, and conversation. And he was a Presbyterian minister who wrote about many different ideas, all concerning religious, political, and moral reform. A rare Englishman in his support for the American Revolution, he may have thought that this opinion allowed him to counsel the Americans. By arguing on moral and economic grounds, he wrote that they should end slavery immediately. He warned, "For it's self-evident that there are any men who think they have a right to hold others in slavery. There may be others who think they have a right to hold them in slavery." A stronger influence on Franklin was Granville Sharp. Man of many interests and talents, he served as a government clerk while writing about social and moral issues. He was a conscientious objector, opposing all wars and staunchly opposed to slavery. In 1750, Sharp met a slave, Jonathan Strong, who had suffered physical problems related to his enslavement, numerous beatings that made him lame and nearly blind. His master, David Lyle, threw him out on the street to make his own way, but Lyle ran into Strong just a couple years later, seeing he was in better physical shape, had him jailed while Lyle looked for a buyer. England had long wrestled with the issue of the slave trade. In 1102, the Church Council of London, a group with no legislative power, abolished slavery. 1700, Lord Chief Sir John Holt decreed that as soon as a man sets foot on English ground, he is free. But in 1729, a decision on a similar matter stated that men were free, but also recognized the slave as property of the master and would be considered a lifelong apprentice. Sharp diligently studied English law and wrote a pamphlet in 1769 titled A Representation of the Injustice and Dangerous Tendency of Tolerating Slavery. He pointed out this system of bondage was related to the serfdom of medieval times, that it is a feudal tyranny which had no place in modern England. And his reasons for ending slavery did influence Lyle as he dropped his case against Sharp. In 1772, the Somerville case decided the fate of slaves in England. James Somerset, a runaway slave, had been living in London when his former master, Charles Stewart, found him and attempted to send him to Jamaica. The court ruled in Somerset's favor, and in doing so in the favor of thousands of slaves throughout Britain by establishing that any former slave once on British soil was free. This decision had a major effect upon Franklin. In that same year, he wrote a piece for the London Chronicle called The Somerset Case and the Slave Trade, in which he condemned the slave trade. He laid out the brutalities of the trade from the Atlantic Passage to the poor working conditions, which he described as excessive labor, bad nourishment, uncomfortable accommodations, and broken spirits. Franklin returned to America in 1775, became a member of the Continental Congress, but didn't use his position and reputation to help steer the Continental Congress toward the abolition of slavery. He was a man for whom compromise was the only way to get this nation started. And he didn't stay long. For in 1776, Congress sent him to France to negotiate a treaty with the French for help in the Revolutionary War. Again, as he had done before when in England, he spent many years in France, and the French considered him to be the quintessential American, a rustic philosopher, though there was nothing rural about this lifelong city dweller. The many years and long lapses of time between negotiating sessions allowed Franklin time for meeting and socializing with France's greatest minds. Most famous meeting occurred between Franklin and the great philosopher Voltaire. Franklin met many others of the intellectual elite of the country. Many of them were against slavery. The Marquis de Condorcet supported equality and liberty for all individuals and groups, and some of his ideas are very extreme, as in support for what we call gay rights. Trained as a scientist, Condorcet is considered one of the pioneers of modern social science, though he impressed in other sciences by his work in setting up a coherent system of weights and measures. He also involved himself in political and economic matters. 1773, he wrote to Franklin on scientific matters, but he also asked Franklin about the condition not only of slaves, but of free blacks in America. Reflecting what he learned on observing African-American children at the school in Philadelphia, Franklin responded that the free blacks are not deficient in natural understanding, but they have not the advantage of education. In 1781, Condorcet wrote his first major work on slavery called Reflections on Negro Slavery. He wrote, to reduce a man to slavery, to purchase him, to sell him, to keep him in servitude, these are crimes, and they are crimes worse than theft. In effect, we strip the slave not only of all mobile and financial property, but his ability to acquire, including everything that nature has given him, so he may conserve his life or satisfy his needs. Franklin returned to the U.S. as an old man, enfeebled by gout and pleurisy, but he stepped up his efforts and reconstituted, with the help of Dr. Benjamin Rush, an abolitionist society. And given his great age, he was not just a figurehead, he was very much involved. But perhaps his mind and his heart always wrestled with each other, even toward the end of his life, as only with his will, upon his death in 1790, did he free his last slaves. From the beginning to the end, it was the conundrum of slavery condemned and condoned. Thank you.
Well, good morning. It's good to see you all. Good to be back in Concord. As some of you know, back in 2018 at the Thoreau conference in Gothenburg, Sweden, I gave a talk about two great American keepers of journals, Henry David Thoreau and George Templeton Strong. This time I'll be focusing on how each of them responded to the issues leading up to the Civil War, which was the great and terrible American Revolution of their time. Thoreau and Strong were contemporaries. Thoreau was born in 1817, Strong in 1820. Thoreau graduated from Harvard in 1837. Strong graduated from Columbia in 1838 when he was still only 18 years old. Thoreau began his journal a few months later, after his graduation, probably at Emerson's suggestion. It eventually totaled about 2 million words. Strong began his diary in 1835 when he was 15 and still an undergraduate. By the time he died, it came to about 4 million words. A selected edition was published in 1952, but the vast majority of it has never appeared in print. In 1979, Professor Daniel Aaron of Harvard helped found the Library of America, a nonprofit publisher that would produce standard editions of American authors. The first volume, devoted to Melville, appeared in 1982. The first Thoreau volume was published in 1985. In 1988, Daniel Aaron published an essay in American Heritage called The Greatest Diarist. His subject was George Templeton Strong. Aaron wrote, "Strong's diary is an astonishing literary achievement, as well as a treasure trove for pillaging historians. He also happens to be the most readable and brilliant of the 19th century American diarists." I first discovered George Templeton Strong, as many people did, through Ken Burns' Civil War documentary, where Strong was voiced by George Plimpton. This is Plimpton in a tuxedo ad that came out around that time. Then in 2007, my wife and I went to the Tenement Museum in New York to hear Pete Hamill talk about the city in the 19th century. During the Q&A, someone asked how they could learn more, and he said, read the diaries of Philip Hone and George Templeton Strong. Sometime later, I found this book, sort of a coffee table book that contains excerpts from the diaries of both Hone and Strong. And I quickly figured out that although Hone was a good writer and observer, Strong was the one who really grabbed me. I wanted to read more, but the 1952 edition was long out of print and expensive. But finally, in 2013, I splurged about $100 on the most affordable copy I could find. I read it straight through and started tweeting excerpts. Before long, I was thinking about how I could bring some of this great material back into print. To make a long story short, I finally succeeded, and I'm very pleased to report that this November, Library of America will publish a volume of Strong's Civil War diaries, edited by me. Daniel Aaron describes Strong as a man of affairs and a conservative and supercilious New York lawyer. Already you can see how different he was from Henry. And yet both men were homebodies, firmly rooted in place. As Thoreau famously said, "I have traveled much and conquered." Oops. This one. Strong often complained about life in New York City, especially the dirt, smells, crime, and corruption. In fact, the same things we complain about today. But the real test is that he never seriously considered living anywhere else. As John Updike once wrote about one of his characters, he had the true New Yorker's secret belief that people living anywhere else had to be, in some sense, kidding. "Very glad I've been to Montauk," Strong wrote in 1846, "just as I'm glad to have had the measles and the whooping cough. It's gone through with, and a recurrence of the thing isn't likely." Like Thoreau, Strong was a lover of animals. He made the unusual decision to keep a black squirrel as a pet and was devastated when it fell ill. He wrote, "It's very unpleasant to see a pet animal sick, especially when he's quite tame and gentle and seems to appeal to one for help and comfort." In 1853, the naturalist Philip Henry Goss created the first public aquarium in London. The next year, Goss published a book that started a bit of an aquarium craze. Strong caught the craze, got a small tank, and stocked it with some fish from an aquarium owned by his friend George Anton. One effect of Strong's aquarium experience was that he began comparing spineless people to marine invertebrates. Referring to the librarian at Columbia, he wrote, "The Reverend Beverly is certainly the meekest and softest and least masculine of male mankind. Were a sea anemone or a jellyfish endowed with the faculty of speech, it would talk as he does." Thoreau and Strong both loved music, but Thoreau had limited opportunities to hear it played by professionals. When he did, he sometimes got carried away. He wrote, "I saw an organ grinder this morning before a rich man's house, thrilling the street with harmony, loosening the very paving stones. It is, after all, perhaps the best instrumental music that we have." Strong, on the other hand, attended all kinds of concerts, as well as church music, and he had much less patience with organ grinders. "I must ascertain whether the mighty bug destroyer Lyons has no modification of his cockroach powder that will exterminate organ grinders." Unlike Thoreau, Strong worked in an office, married, raised children, voted, and went to church, sometimes 3 different churches on the same Sunday. He liked smoking pipes and cigars, and he was fond of coffee, sometimes drinking 6 cups in a row. Strong was also a joiner. He was a vestryman of Trinity Church, a trustee of Columbia College, a member of the New York Historical Society, the founder of the Church Music Association, and the president of the Philharmonic Society of New York, among other positions. So how did Thoreau and Strong respond to the issues that led to the Civil War and the war itself? Here are some highlights. The institution of slavery was, of course, at the root of the Civil War. Thoreau's mother and sisters belonged to the Concord Female Anti-Slavery Society. His sister Helen was known and respected by Frederick Douglass. That's Helen on the left and Sophia on the right. Thoreau himself helped escaped slaves along the Underground Railroad. In 1851, he wrote, "Just put a fugitive slave who has taken the name of Henry Williams into the cars for Canada." The Fugitive Slave Act required Northerners to capture formerly enslaved people and return them to slavery in the South. In 1854, Anthony Burns was hired out by his owner to a man in Falmouth, Massachusetts. Burns escaped to Boston, only to be recaptured. The case sparked outrage among abolitionists and a violent attempt to free him. Thoreau responded with his speech and essay, Slavery in Massachusetts. He wrote, "The whole military force of the state is at the service of a Mr. Suttle, a slaveholder from Virginia, to enable him to catch a man whom he calls his property. But not a soldier is offered to save a citizen of Massachusetts from being kidnapped." A few years later, Thoreau talked with Casey, a free black man living in Concord. Thoreau wrote, "He may have been 20 years old when stolen from Africa, left a wife and 1 child there. He used to say that he went home to Africa in the night and came back again in the morning, i.e., he dreamed of home." Strong was also impressed by the idea of an enslaved man returning to his home in his dreams, but in his case he got the idea by way of literature. In 1842 he wrote, "Looked this afternoon into Longfellow's New Slavery poems. Very fair generally, but the professor has done better." Strong wrote that his favorite of these poems was about an enslaved man who had been a great king in Africa. He goes to sleep and dreams that his queen is with him again and that he is riding along the banks of the Niger River. But the poem isn't enough to convince Strong that slavery is evil. He goes on in the same entry, "It's a puzzling subject, the same abolitionism. There is but one question involved in it. Is slavery morally right or wrong? And that's a question which I can't answer." We know about Thoreau and his plea for Captain John Brown, who was sentenced to death after his unsuccessful attack on the arsenal at Harper's Ferry, Virginia. Thoreau wrote, "I rejoice that I live in this age, that I am his contemporary." Strong's view was very different. Like many people, he saw Brown as a fanatical murderer, possibly insane. After Harper's Ferry, he wrote, "The leader, old Osawatomie John Brown of Kansas, seems cracked. Insanity won't save him from the gallows. He will undoubtedly be hanged." On April 12, 1861, Confederate forces fired on Fort Sumter, marking the beginning of the Civil War. By this time, Thoreau had made his contribution to the struggle. A few months earlier, he had caught a bad cold, which turned into bronchitis and eventually led to his death. He was mostly confined to his bed, where one of his regular visitors was Horace Mann, Jr. Thoreau's first entry after Fort Sumter begins, "Horace Mann says that he killed a bullfrog in Walden Pond, which had swallowed and contained a common striped snake." But just as Thoreau's engagement with the war was winding down, Strong's was just getting going. In less than 2 years, his opinion of Brown had changed. He wrote, "Osawatomie John Brown would be worth his weight in gold just now. What a pity he precipitated matters and got himself prematurely hanged." On April 18, 6 days after the attack on Fort Sumter, Strong saw the 6th Massachusetts Regiment march through Manhattan. "Immense crowd," he wrote, "immense cheering. My eyes filled with tears and I was half choked in sympathy with a contagious excitement." In June, Strong joined the U.S. Sanitary Commission as treasurer and member of the executive committee. He's the one standing on the left, having grown this luxuriant mustache. In October 61, Strong met President Lincoln. He wrote, "He seems to me clear-headed and sound-hearted, though his laugh is the laugh of a Yahoo, with a wrinkling of the nose that suggests affinity with a tapir and other pachyderms, and his grammar is weak." The Sanitary Commission began its work of raising money, collecting supplies, publishing reports on hygiene and medicine, and organizing surgeons and nurses to tend to sick and wounded Union soldiers. One of these nurses was Louisa May Alcott. In 1862, when she reached the minimum age of 30, she began working at the Union Hotel Hospital in Washington, D.C. She intended to serve for 3 months, but had to leave after 6 weeks when she got typhoid fever. In 1863, Strong and some of his colleagues from the Sanitary Commission founded the Union League Club of New York City. The club was intended to bolster Union loyalty in New York. Southern sympathizers, known as Copperheads, were excluded from membership. In July, the Union Army began drafting soldiers in New York City. If you had enough money, you could avoid the draft by paying $300 or hiring a substitute. About a day later, riots broke out. Many of these were aimed at black residents on the theory that they were responsible for the war. Strong wrote, "Omnibus down to number 823. It's 823 Broadway, where the Sanitary Commission had its headquarters. 823 wears news that the colored half-orphan asylum on Fifth Avenue, just above the reservoir, is burned." Strong and his colleague Walcott Gibbs tried to get the mayor, George Opdyke, and General John Wool to take action. He wrote, "We begged that martial law might be declared. Opdyke said that was Wool's business, and Wool said it was Opdyke's, and neither would act." Before this, Strong hadn't paid much attention to black people. He usually saw them as a social problem that he preferred not to think about. The draft riot marked a change in his attitude. He wrote about black New Yorkers, "They are the most peaceable, sober, and inoffensive of our poor, and the outrages they have suffered during this last week are less excusable than St. Bartholomew's or the Jew hunting of the Middle Ages." The Sanitary Commission began holding a series of fairs to raise money in various cities. In New York City, the Metropolitan Fair in April 1864 raised more than $1 million. The Great Central Fair in Philadelphia also raised more than $1 million. Earlier in the year, the Sanitary Commission held a fair in Brooklyn. It published a daily paper called The Drumbeat while the fair was going on. On February 29th, the paper published this cartoon. Strong cut it out and pasted it into his journal. The teamster loading up sacks of money is certainly Strong himself, although the cartoonist got his middle initial wrong. Strong often complained in his journal that he was weak, sickly, and ineffective. It must have felt good to see himself shown in this useful and commanding position. In the end, it may be impossible to say whether it was Thoreau or Strong who did more to help win the Civil War and point the way toward a better country. Thoreau's essays continue to inspire activists. His work famously influenced leaders like Mahatma Gandhi and Martin Luther King Jr. Strong's contributions are much less well known, but certainly enormous. His work contributed to saving great numbers of lives and paving the way for organizations like the Red Cross. The lesson, if there is one, may be that to bring about social reform takes more than one kind of person and more than one kind of approach. When each person contributes according to their own strengths, the chances of lasting success are greatest. Thank you.
Good morning. Growing up near the vast, rugged forests of Washington, poet, essayist, and environmental activist Gary Snyder brings his unique wilderness perspective to the nature writing table. He first shaped his writing's purpose from his nature-rooted childhood in the 1930s, and as he grew into adulthood, sharpened his writing's focus with the goal of protecting and preserving wild spaces like Washington's. As a prominent member of the Beat movement in the 1960s, Snyder used his voice to assert that nature must be respected, communed with, and preserved. Called the, quote, Thoreau of the Beat generation by fellow poet Lawrence Ferlinghetti, he built his late 20th century ecocentric work on a foundation established by the most influential American nature writer, Henry David Thoreau. Though about 100 years elapsed between the publication of Walden and Snyder's earliest writings, the connection between Thoreau and Snyder is evident, perhaps most notably in Snyder's The Practice of the Wild. With a century of time and knowledge available to him, Snyder's more worldly views advance what Thoreau uncovered about the interdependent human-nature bond while at Walden Pond. In the following discussion, I wish to demonstrate how both men's writing reveal an empathic connectedness with nature and the wild, a definitive transcendentalism, and a pursuit for a higher purpose in the larger world. Both writers chose to be transformed by nature, becoming so absorbed within it. It affected every aspect of their lives. I hope to add to current scholarship through my analysis of their deep relationship to their surrounding landscapes. Finding one's purpose is often driven by tragedy and trauma, and Henry Thoreau's life was impacted by heartbreaking loss. When his brother John died, Henry was only 24 years old, and his world was suddenly bleak and meaningless. But after several months of mourning, Henry uncovered the beginning of his life's purpose. Through his grief, Henry found a deeper connection and understanding to and through his natural surroundings. He realized he needed to stop and listen so that he might connect. She continues, quote, John's death became Henry Thoreau's birth, the birth of the writer who would voice nature to the world, end quote. Henry, who was inherently respectful and bound to nature, had finally found a way to communicate that bond. Perhaps nowhere is that more clearly demonstrated than in this homage to Walden Pond. Why, here is Walden, the same woodland lake that I discovered so many years ago. It is the same liquid joy and happiness to itself and its maker, and it may be to me. I see by its face that it is visited by the same reflection, and I can almost say, Walden, is it you? Henry speaks to the pond as if it takes human form and has become a friend, and his connection to the Walden landscape is rooted so deeply within himself. He and the pond are nearly indistinguishable. He can empathize with it, take pride in its ability to rebound, and find hope in the renewal of life in this one very familiar landscape that he calls home. And after years of tragedy, John's death, later his sister's and his close friend Ralph Waldo Emerson's young son's passing, Henry was comforted by the renewal and constancy of nature. Walden Pond has not changed in its character, he notes, quote, all the change is in me, end quote. Through Walden, Henry Thoreau finds his purpose to call attention to the need for the preservation of the landscape surrounding us all. Quote, where is the country's champion? To meet him at the deep cut and thrust an avenging lance between the ribs of the bloated pest, end quote. Thoreau could not be clearer. Nature desperately needs more guardians. Through his work and writing, Gary Snyder answers Thoreau's call to preserve the wilderness. Snyder notes that he was reading Walden while he was writing his first book of poems, Rip Rap, at 23 years old as a fire lookout in the Cascade Mountains. The reader can feel Snyder's reverence for the landscape around him in this short poem. Down valley a smoke haze, 3 days heat after 5 days rain. Pitch glows on the fir cones, across rocks and meadows, swarms of new flies. I cannot remember things I once read, a few friends, but they are in cities, drinking cold snow water from a tin cup, looking down for miles through high still air. Snyder is completely present in his surroundings, just as Thoreau was in his works, capturing the deeper understanding of nature that Thoreau established at Walden Pond. In that communion, that empathy, Snyder will establish a career of guarding and preserving nature just as Thoreau implored. impermanent, open, imperfect, and then be grateful for impermanence and the freedom it grants us, end quote. What he speaks of here is absolute maturity, an evolution beyond the selfish nature that humanity has generally used as a guiding force for centuries. David Robinson notes, quote, as Snyder conceives it, the concept of the wild provides a useful analog for human social and political organization, and thus leads us to a new vision of an expanded and reinvigorated democracy, end quote. Thoreau felt similarly to Snyder, particularly after he made a move to New York City for a time, and as Laura Walls notes, witnessed the corporate world, quote, being born, and his, quote, transcendentalist convictions confirmed. Nature permitted no shortcuts. Reform must start with the inner self, not the outer circumstances, end quote. Snyder and Thoreau see nature as the foundation, the teacher, and the model for what civilization could be in its most glorious form. Within Snyder's writing, the reader sees his unwavering assertion that nature must be understood, communed with, and preserved. As he observed in the Buddhist tradition, humanity must be stewards of animals and nature. Humanity could not continue in its destructive path, and he sought to bring a voice to the very vulnerable nature. A member of the 1960s counterculture beat movement, Snyder looked beyond the expectations of the seemingly mundane American life, hoping to push the boundaries of existence. Rick Blyer notes, quote, beat implied a ragged kind of illumination, a state of grace for the disenfranchised, end quote. Living on the edges of their contemporary cultures, both Snyder and Thoreau understood being marginalized. For Snyder, it was the Native Americans, and for Thoreau, it was those desperate to escape slavery. Each man endeavored to fight for the most vulnerable among them, and that campaign extended to the wilderness as well. Both writers recognized nature's helplessness to defend against overuse and extinction, but they could not have had that realization without first understanding their own vulnerability and that of their fellow man. In near seclusion at Walden, Thoreau immerses himself in his natural surroundings, and Snyder spends time throughout his life alone in the wilderness. A crucial component to note is the risk they took to do these experiments. One must have faith in the cause and a deep motivation to lay bare the vulnerabilities within. Even with a century of time between their lives, they share a bond, or more accurately, an alliance. John Teitel states, quote, Thoreau and Snyder used hermetic withdrawal as purification, as a detoxification of social poisons. Each acted in the surety that vulnerability to nature leads to the fullest expression of one's humanity and permits the natural passions to flow without corruption, end quote. When confronted by the wilderness, they were fortunate enough, but still chose to be transformed. Snyder's life was etched by time spent in a post-Walden world, where nature writing was beginning to take shape and gain ground among those looking for change in the polluted, disconnected world. He states in the Practice of the Wild, quote, we must honor this land's great antiquity, its wildness, learn it, defend it, and work to hand it on to the children of all beings of the future with its biodiversity and health intact. Excuse me, end quote. Snyder's insistence that all beings deserve a champion is the same conclusion that Thoreau drew before his short life ended at 44. Their shared transcendentalism brings them to a common endpoint, that all of the wild is worthy of defending and preserving. That recognition of Thoreau's significant contribution to the world is important. Snyder is alluding to the choice Thoreau made on multiple occasions of loss to become better through and because of nature. Snyder's discussion of the crazed early explorers of the Americas who often killed natives and usurped their power in the Practice of the Wild highlights what happens when humans do not choose to become better, nor choose to seek any sort of mature evolution. We all seek a purpose, a God to worship, so that we might find our way, but that does not always result in personal growth towards the betterment of all. Sometimes our self-serving drive is what we succumb to, and in that lies the difficulty in persuading some of humanity to invest in a mutually respectful relationship with nature. As Thoreau looked to evolve with nature as his guide, he became intimately connected to it, and he saw the grace, beauty, and perfection in it all. He found his something to worship, a mixture of nature and God and the harmony produced by being fully immersed and alive in the one constant on earth. Only he can put it so beautifully at the conclusion of his time at Walden Pond. Quote, I learned this, at least, by my experiment, that if one advances confidently in the direction of his dreams and endeavors to live the life which he has imagined, he will meet with a success unexpected in common hours, end quote. Snyder, who at 85 was still climbing mountains to continue his walk with nature, hopefully proclaims, quote, "The new America is right around the corner," end quote. He continues to model what connectedness to nature looks like in his daily life, and he looks for the Thoreau in his beloved Sierra Nevada mountain range. Quote, "Thoreau's presence in the Sierra Nevada high country has a deep reverberation," end quote. That echo of Thoreau and Snyder are what we need to listen for. Their call to become spiritually connected to the wild, become modern transcendentalists who yearn for a better version of ourselves and expect the same renewal for the earth around us. And maybe, if we are fortunate enough, in the pursuit to protect the landscape created to support us, we will find the way towards that higher purpose of looking beyond ourselves and what is comfortable so that we may find a beautiful relationship to earth.
It's been a minute, so I will reintroduce myself as Gregor MacGregor, which is not a joke, but I am used to chuckles in the audience. So if that was your initial inclination, that is completely fine. As an attorney, I feel like I'm an expert, but as a Thoreauvian, I feel very much to be merely an enthusiast. So it is wonderful to be here with you all, speaking with you all, and to hedge any bets that I got things wrong. Now, as an enthusiast, it can be a real challenge to find the place for philosophy when teaching law students and professional students in a master's program of environmental studies. These are people who are looking to become climate planners, to develop renewable energy, to become fiery attorneys who will indeed sue the bastards. And when I teach the history of American environmental movements, I'm often confronted by the misconception that Thoreau was a lazy, misanthropic hypocrite at worst, or that he was merely a thinker on nature at best. What could such a man contribute to a generation eager to get its hands dirty? Let me set the scene with some imitations. Revolutionary Praxis? Are you kidding me? Thoreau didn't even do his own laundry at Walden. It seems to come up more often than anything else. I'm sure you're aware he often dined at his own mother's house or at his wealthy friend's home. He often entertained at his shack, and it could hardly be considered to be nature or wilderness. He never worked. His ode to outdoor recreation, walking, demonstrates an intense privilege. What a hypocrite. Of course, you here are all aware of Henry's free time activities, at least when he wasn't doodling next to a twice-hoed field of beans. The original dude harbored runaway slaves, spoke alongside Frederick Douglass, and was the first person to speak out in defense of John Brown after Harper's Ferry. And like many of my students, I was once myself ignorant of these many events, despite a college professor who revealed to me the great comedy held within Walden, and especially its first and longest chapter, Economy. So if the man was not himself a lying layabout, why don't we hear about it? And I believe the answer is because it's important that you think he was a hypocrite. Otherwise, you may have to believe that his very real service to abolition, supported by his intellectual stance on racial equality and civil disobedience, means you also need to consider an act on his disparagement of wealth and material excess. In his introduction to the 1971 subversive play, The Night Thoreau Spent in Jail, co-author Robert E. Lee, not that one, says, "The man imprisoned in our play belongs more to the moment than to the age in which he lived." And it's clear that Lee and Jerome Lawrence had read the corpus of the hermit deeply and found what their moment called for. His opposition to the Mexican-American War struck a chord in the early years of the Vietnam draft. And if the play eventually struck a nerve for the public, that sting must have receded enough for the drama to have appeared in my high school education many years later. But perhaps our nerves should have stayed rawer to its message, I thought, just 2 years after George W. Bush launched his ill-gotten war in Iraq, our horrendous disgrace at Abu Ghraib, and our defense of a system of endless detention, black sites, and waterboarding. Enhanced interrogation techniques. Perhaps the environmental and corporate sting of the 1850s would also serve us just as well today, more than 50 years after the publication of the play. We face a greater physical threat to the commons than Thoreau could have imagined, even if he correctly ascribed its root malice and contempt. The current corporate culture is the ultimate, perhaps unavoidable progeny of that which flooded Concord's riparian grass meadows, forbade the picking of wild foods in the forest, and precipitated the cultural forsaking of nature, however maintained or wild. Every year, another corporation's miracle product is revealed to be the cancerous and environmentally deleterious compound they've known it was for 40 plus years. Can you imagine how many grant dollars have been wasted just replicating these studies done by the oil and gas industry on global warming to confirm their own results from the 1970s, or to uncover the ills of PFAS and PFOA and other so-called and so existing forever chemicals? Few people benefited from the inundation of the Concord River. Many more today are harmed by the rising waters around us. Now, the press of America's privatized history isn't the only thing tying Thoreau's environmental woes to ours. The very physical work of his obsessive observations tells us just how bad things have become. Studies are using Henry's notes on the days flowers bloomed, birds returned, and plants let out their foliage to study how these species are adapting or maladapting to climate change. This very early citizen science is allowing us to not only experience our own political upheaval, but also the changing physical world around us through his eyes. Now, if we have sufficiently linked Thoreau's environmentalism and abolitionism to action, let's turn to matters of material wealth. Thoreau's first job, as I'm sure you all are aware, upon graduating from Harvard was as a school teacher in Concord. He often spared the rod, until a school committee member demanded he visit corporal punishment upon his pupils. Afterward, Henry felt that he had made himself complicit in an immoral institution, becoming its instrument of random violence and exploitation, even if those realities were the norm of his age. So the following day, he resigned. Yes, he resigned and sought a means of living which did not degrade himself or others, and which allowed him to work at his own appointed time. Henry lived at the nascent age of American industrial capitalism, symbolized by mechanical looms, the railroad, and the accumulation of other people's time and profits. His recognition of those developments sounds like it would be just at home on pre-Elon Twitter as it does in Walden. The principal object is not that mankind may be well and honestly clad, but unquestionably that the corporations may be enriched of contributing to such a system, even if it were well remunerated. He quizzed himself, his peers, and all of us. It is not enough to be industrious, so are the ants. What are you industrious about? Many of us asked this very question during and after the days of the COVID-19 lockdown, whether from our employers' willingness to sacrifice our lives to remain open, or whether from those corporations which are now clawing back the freedoms to work at our own appointed time in our homes, so begrudgingly given. We have recognized that there's a greater meaning to our lives than full dedication to the shareholders or the bottom line. If you feel like you've been railroaded at work, remember David Henry's observation. We do not ride on the railroad, it rides upon us. Did you ever think that those sleepers are that underlie the railroad? Each one is a man, an Irish man or a Yankee man. The rails are laid on them and they are covered with sand and the cars run smoothly over them. They are sound sleepers, I assure you. And every few years, a new lot is laid down and run over, so that if some have the pleasure of riding on a rail, others have the misfortune to be ridden upon. I hope to dispel the criticism that Henry was a lazy, unindustrious person for my students, But let's recognize that the critiques leveled against him are the same critiques that are leveled at the modern great resigners. Nobody wants to work anymore. The bosses cry out as they pay 2009's federal minimum wage, while also turning a pretty profit paying Denmark workers $22 an hour to flip those same burgers. What of quiet quitting? The simple fulfillment of one's contractual terms without the volunteering of anything more of your free labor. Moral critique of workers' habits have always accrued profits to those who benefit from the workers' continued exploitation, and our society's misplaced moral judgment on Henry's fabricated lack of work is meant to dissuade us from taking up his mantle and acting on the ills of society that we face, as does the next bad faith critique that we can't take Thoreau seriously because of his privileges in his life that allowed him to live deliberately in line with his values. Let's begin with the fact that Thoreau was privileged. He was a white man at a time when the Constitution of our country only spoke of white men. He went to Harvard, even though begrudgingly, and had a network of family and friends that could house and support him, even as he chose a life of relative poverty. His many choices were undergirded by his very ability to make them, something that many of his society and ours did not and do not have the luxury to do, including the slaves and wage earners he encountered in Walden Pond's vicinity. Yet, if we asked Henry whether he had checked his privilege, we would find that he did. Thoreau's individualism stemmed from the desire not to burden others through his existence, and the recognition that many of his society lacked the ability to do so. The laboring man has not leisure for a true integrity day by day, he says. They have no time to be anything but a machine. And through working like a machine for the profit of others, he saw the better part of man is soon plowed into the soil for compost. When asked what he did with that privilege, we find him taking many risks to his life, liberty, and fortunes. And we also find him practicing the many forms of community assistance that we, the privileged, white, educated masses of our day, are trying desperately to get back to. Imagine what our society would look like if we did the former in addition to the latter. If Thoreau can be both discredited and embraced as part of our literary canon, then he can join many other thinkers and movements in American history that have only been begrudgingly and partially included. The new generation's acceptance of Black, Hispanic, Asian, Indigenous, trans, and other non-majority points of view on America's history and the future is at least partially built upon the dismantling of one such persistent misrepresentation, that of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. The incorporation of King's racial message into our American identity, in principle, if not in practice, remains the focus of our study of the civil rights movement in public school and in public discourse. But it has also served as a shield or convenient highlight with which to ignore the economic message that undergirded King's vision of racial equality. By the 2000s, the majority of millennials and the generations to follow could finally be reached en masse by the internet and alternative publications to be shown what many minority activists, thinkers, and citizens had known from the beginning, that King's words were being presented incompletely at best and at worst were being misused to perpetuate the very system against which he railed. Now, the legacy of American thought, whether it be Henry David Thoreau's or Martin Luther King Jr.'s, depends on how we study it and how we communicate it, especially these movements and ideas that have only been begrudgingly incorporated into the mainstream. Regardless of whether you teach high school, literature, law, environmental studies, or simply the friends around you, we must teach that revolutionary praxis is an American tradition and birthright. Too often we stop at the country's literal revolution, the Civil War, and the racial aspects of the civil rights movement when considering how Americans have taken and can take action to create a more perfect union. Americans must understand the extent to which their unique intellectual heritage entitles them and has entitled them from the beginning to question the status quo in renewing our inherited nation. Each of us is brought into the world without our consent and asked to assume the debts of its injustices. We must choose what to do with that debt. Far from being a quirky but harmless scribbler in the woods, Thoreau chose to be one of the flames constituting the conflagration for which John Buren's entitled his book. And I'm not saying, as is often interjected, that Thoreau is beyond criticism or reproach, but both the critique of his work ethic and the critique of his position in our society are both a part of a long line of bad faith arguments meant to discredit progressive ideas in our country. These critiques come from people who have no actual interest in engaging in the very questions they raise. She's not down with the cause, one conservative political pundit opined in questioning whether Kamala Harris was Black enough to count as the Black candidate in the 2024 presidential election. What happened to the tolerant left has become such a common misframing of liberal positions on the internet that it is practically a joke. These and many others represent the co-opting of a movement's own language in order to discredit it, requiring the speaker to approach a non-existent level of purity in order to be considered, and for which the critic has no interest in the first place. The discrediting is the point. So maybe, just maybe, there's someone and something we can call on from America's first intellectual movement to inform our own, or at least we can know what the hell we're talking about. Because Henry was not a heroic archetype, an ascetic state of the proper class or other identity, nor was he the perfect exemplar of our ideals, much less his own. But this is the point. He was a human full of contradictions, full of love and fervor and missteps. We don't need Thoreau to be perfect to consider his ideas, his work, his view of capital and freedom, and to apply them to our society today. And more important, we don't need to be perfect in order to look at the circumstances that surround us and to better them for ourselves and our neighbors. On this point, if you have lived in a house with running water and electricity your whole life, you've probably never done your own laundry. I've had machines do my laundry, like everyone else of our age. Thoreau and his mom paid a maid to do theirs, just like everyone else of their age. So Thoreau thought, worked, and operated in a world of changing values where the pains of war and violence threatened the nation. Revolutions in transportation and industry produced wealth and ravaged the environment. The country had to reconcile its professed values with the treatment of racial minorities, and individuals were left to situate themselves vis-a-vis these historical forces. When we explore these aspects of early America, our students can begin to see our world in his. When we illuminate his revolutionary praxis as a slave harborer, great resigner, and critic of the dehumanizing exploitation of labor by capital, my students can begin to see themselves in him. Thank you.
Okay, we have time for quick 3 or 4 questions.
Mr. Gregor, as a tour guide and museum interpreter, I hear questions about Thoreau's hypocrisy on a daily basis. And I love your point about how we don't need Thoreau to be perfect to be influenced by his ideas. One of the things that I like to point out to visitors when they ask us questions is that we like to see Thoreau's ideas as timeless. But he graduated from Harvard the same month that Victoria was crowned Queen of England. So he had timeless ideas, but when he woke up in the morning, he woke up in the middle of the 19th century, and inevitably the details of his life are going to reflect that.
I agree.
Frank, I asked you this question about Benjamin Franklin. If he were alive today and he spent his time in France the way Ben Franklin did, cavorting, partying? Where do you think he would be in the political spectrum today?
I have no idea. I do say that he paid dearly for his enjoyments in France. He developed gout and pleurisy during those years. And much to the disappointment of John Adams, who joined him a couple of years after Franklin went to France, Franklin understood the upper classes of the French and how to appeal to them. That's why he put on that rustic exterior, which was totally false. He knew how to play the French, and he was very successful. He was representing a country that wasn't a country, with an army that didn't win wars, but they gave us all sorts of help. And because of that, he came back home with a treaty of peace with Britain. So I don't know what he would do living that life in France now, but I do know that he is the major person, the main thing why the colonies were successful. Because without all that money and munitions that France gave us, it would have been much more difficult for us militarily. Thank you.
All the way back.
This is Mullinax. First, I wanted to thank you. You read my favorite poem in its entirety. Anyone who's been around me for the past few months has had to hear me recite it, so it's great to hear it from you. When I was listening to your talk, I was thinking about the relationship between self-cultivation and sort of bioregionalism, like the way in which sort of Cronin, Snyder, achieving this awareness of the bioregion is also an act of self-cultivation and an act of sort of working on the self. And I was just wondering if you could sort of speak to that in a way that you must your reading.
I'm not sure if I understand what you mean, that how they kind of cultivate themselves, is that what you're saying?
Sort of how you find in Thoreau and Snyder this relationship between the cultivation of the self and sort of self-becoming, along with, bioregionalism at the same time, right? Like for Thoreau going out to the woods, focus out to the woods, cultivating the self. And
Sure. No, and that's actually what drew me to both of them when I did my master's, but Gary Snyder, both of them have tremendous loss, and for Snyder it was a little different and his was a little later, but each of them continued to kind of find, it's for me, it's an empathic connection. And even just being back here in Concord this week and being in Thoreau's presence in a lot of ways, you can feel, it's almost therapy, right? We would kind of seek out a therapist, and neither of them, because Gary Snyder's 95 and he was born in 1930, and he talks about having to kind of figure things out and, on his own, as I kind of mentioned about, on his dairy farm. And I think both of them seek to sort of keep my friend alive almost. That's what I kind of felt like when it was, I'm out in nature, she's given me, I guess you don't say she's given me so much. I need to help preserve her, kind of fight for my best friend in a lot of ways. So I feel like, does that help? That answers your question?
yeah.
Okay.
We have a question for Geoff. Now we can finish.
Was Strong aware of Thoreau?
As far as I know, Strong was not aware of Thoreau, and Thoreau was not aware of Strong. It's possible that they could have seen each other during the few months that Thoreau was living on Staten Island, and went into Manhattan from time to time to see Horace Greeley and others. But as far as I know, they had no awareness of each other. Strong did apparently attend at least one lecture of Bronson Alcott, so that formed his extremely low opinion of transcendentalism.
If you have a question, please ask that. But you need to let everyone. Thank you.
Before the box lunch, please give your ticket that's in your little packet that came with the envelope, came with the registration to Carla. She'll be at the station back there.
We'll set up tables with